Time now for our regular look at some of the stories behind the headlines. The German newspaper, The Local, that has that story that we already featured in the bulletin. Domestic intelligence agencies placing the far-right Alternative for Germany, the AfD party, under observation because it's regarded as a potential threat to Germany's democracy. Brazil is currently experiencing the worst moments of its entire COVID-19 pandemic. President Jair Bolsonaro, he has sent his foreign minister to Israel. 3.3% of Brazil's population has so far received one dose of COVID-19 vaccines. And the new cases of infection and deaths are rising. But he apparently has heard of a spray. He says it sounds like a miracle product, so he sent his foreign minister to Israel to investigate. Here in the UK, royal aides have accused Meghan Markle of bullying. A few days before her TV interview with Oprah Winfrey, the Times newspaper says the actions of Prince Harry's wife drove two personal assistants out of the couple's home at Kensington Palace. And the Japanese billionaire, well, he is Yusaku Maezawa. He is now inviting 8 members of the public to join him when he makes his trip around the moon. He, of course, will pay for all of it. And he's going to go up in Elon Musk's SpaceX. This is in the Japanese paper, the Mainichi. Editor of the Sunday Mirror, Nigel Nelson, and the French-Algerian journalist Nabila Ramdani are our two guests today. Thank you very much indeed both for your time. Nabila, shall we start with you? When you consider the AfD party's political stance and the things it says in public, some people might not be surprised that it's come to this.
Well, Germany is a hugely successful modern democracy and an economic powerhouse. But if there is one word that terrifies it more than any other, it is extremist. And, you know, the Second World War ended almost 80 years ago, but the spectre of fascism is something that German leaders are always wary of, given that their terrifying history, frankly. And I doubt it needed the intelligence services to spot the far-right nationalism in the Alternative for Germany party. But it's officially government agents who have gathered evidence suggesting that it could be a danger to democracy. And that's why they've classed it as a suspected extremist group. Now, let's not be under any illusions. The AfD is an anti-immigrant and anti-Islamic party, and its popularity surged in 2015 after some 1 million new migrants entered Germany. And its rhetoric is highly inflammatory, and it attracts the kind of thugs who are often involved in violent street demonstration. Now, during my visits to Germany, I've always been conscious about how sensitive people are about the prospect of radical change, especially from populist groups. The country was one of the most civilized in the world in the 1930s. And yet the extremists still managed to take power. And following, you know, the Trump experience in America and the rise of the far right across Europe, the Germans aren't and won't be taking any chances. It has to be said that the AfD has described the decision to put them under surveillance as purely political. And of course, it is political. It's the first time in post-war history that a German political party with seats in the national parliament has received the extremist designation.
Nigel, let me throw a few names at you. Geert Wilders, Jörg Haider, the Austrian, now deceased. Matteo Salvini in Italy, Marine Le Pen. But then there's a name that we've been discussing earlier in this program, Viktor Orban. And he is a prime minister, a man who has said that Muslims devalue Christian values. What's going on?
Well, I think that the whole surge of populism has gone right across Europe, and that is the big problem. And populism comes with it a certain amount of extremism. We saw that with President Trump in America. Now, I think that on something like this, I agree with Nabila, that if you're dealing with an extremist organization, one appreciates they've got 89 seats in the Bundestag, but if they're extremists, then they do need to be monitored. And I don't think that, for instance, is an affront to democracy in any way. During the Civil War in Northern Ireland over here, that we had the IRA, which was a terrorist group, and a political wing, Sinn Féin. A Sinn Féiner, Martin McGuinness, became First Minister of Northern Ireland, effectively Prime Minister. He'd previously been a senior IRA commander. Now, I'm sure our intelligence services were monitoring him. So it seems to me that it's a perfectly reasonable stance to take. And as Nabila has mentioned, we've also got to remember Germany's history, that Hitler was terribly keen on democracy until he wasn't. So he had referendums, he took part in elections until he got rid of all of them. So democracy is no kind of safeguard against this kind of extremism.
Nabila, the thing is, the IRA were designated as a terrorist group. Golden Dawn in Greece, that is now banned, that, according to a court judgment, was just a criminal organization masquerading as a political organization. But AfD is a legitimate, at the moment, political party. But what about the thin line that exists between being a political party and actually being an organization that promotes fascism and hate speech and therefore violence towards the other?
Well, it is a political party, but it has to be mentioned that it is already under surveillance in a number of German states. But the decision means that now its activities can be observed nationwide. Now, interestingly, AfD MPs and members of the European Parliament will be excluded from any operations, which in my view might be an oversight. Let's not forget that the far-right Rassemblement National party in France, whose figurehead, of course, and leader is Marine Le Pen, has its power base in the European Parliament, for example. So it's hugely important that, in my view, its surveillance should be extended to its prominent political figures.
OK, let's move on. Brazil's COVID-19 pandemic is amazingly at its worst moment since it began. Nigel, Jair Bolsonaro, we could have almost done a story about him every single day. I mean, apparently he's now threatened state governors that if they don't open up, he's going to sue them. And we've had multiple stories about how he doesn't even believe that the thing is that serious a disease. It's not actually that crazy that he thinks that there's a miracle spray, because there are scientific investigations and research going on into how to administer potential medicine through a mist. But Bolsonaro is losing the battle in terms of leadership in the pandemic.
Yes, indeed. And Bolsonaro is probably the example of how not to try and handle a pandemic. He's opposed lockdowns. He's talked about COVID as being no worse than a cold. Now he's sent off a 10-strong delegation to Israel to have a look at a nasal spray that's not been properly tested, that's just going through an experimental experiments at the moment, experimental trials. And even he says he's got absolutely no idea what this spray does. Now, in the meantime, you've only got just over 3% of the population being vaccinated, which is a far better route to getting rid of COVID, as we've been seeing in the UK and in other countries, than trying to go for some kind of experimental cure. Now, at the moment, he's facing from opposition parties, he's facing calls for his removal because of the way he's handled the pandemic. And the trouble about all this is that once you start getting it wrong, lives are at stake. And so unless Bolsonaro gets a grip, I do fear for Brazilians.
It is quite incredible, Nabila, how leadership and the trust between the citizenry and that leadership has become almost the most important thing after the science regarding globally COVID-19.
Yes, indeed. And what is certain is that Brazil, because of its, in part of its poor leadership, is going through absolute hell during the pandemic. And all countries have suffered horribly. But as countries start to get millions vaccinated, the death toll is soaring in Brazil, with politicians likening the crisis to an atomic bomb going off. Now it sounds as though the country is hoping a miracle spray will help them. And so a Brazilian delegation, as you said, has headed to Israel to try and find it. And it's called the ExoCD24. And the Brazilians are hopeful you can just spray it up people's noses to cure them of COVID-19. It's at a development stage now, but it would be just the kind of product that would suit a massive country like Brazil. And Israel has called it a huge breakthrough and said that it was administered to 30 patients whose conditions were moderate or worse, and all 30 recovered, 29 of them, in fact, within 3 to 5 days. And of course, figures like that certainly sound amazing, but I suspect a lot more research and indeed trials are needed to make sure that it really works as a potential game changer in fighting the COVID-19 illness. And I have to, one thing has to be said is that, and that has been very evident throughout the pandemic, is how keen Israel has been to place itself in the forefront of the fight against COVID-19, but you do wish it would put similar effort into looking after the Palestinians on land that it is stealing and indeed occupying.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very important point, which we have covered, of course, on TRT World. OK, because this is a very British story, Nigel, I'll start with you on this one. I mean, this allegation that Meghan Markle bullied 2 employees at Kensington Palace, the royal household where she was living with her husband, Prince Harry. What do you make of this? I mean, just in the past 40 minutes or so, Buckingham Palace has issued a statement saying that it's extremely concerned and is going to look into it. But is there a single British newspaper that actually takes Meghan Markle's side?
No, probably not. But the point basically is that that when Buckingham Palace feel threatened, they start fighting back. And what this feels like at the moment, whether it's coming from the palace or from friends of the royal family, it feels like that they're trying to get their attack lines in first before Meghan and Harry appear on Oprah Winfrey's show on Sunday in America. Something very similar happened to Princess Diana when she gave her bombshell interview telling all. The palace absolutely froze her out. So I would have thought that Prince Harry should have actually seen this coming. He'd have known that the palace fights back. The moment that a member of the royal family takes their internal squabbles to the media, then there is an operation mounted against them to discredit them. Now, I don't know the truth of these allegations against Meghan, but it certainly feels by the timing of it that it's all to do with trying to undermine her before she appears on Oprah's show.
Nabila, my editor, Chuck, and my wife have one thing in common, and only one thing. They both watch The Crown, and they both have told me today that this is like an episode of The Crown. And then my teenage girls asked me just the other day, they said, why are the British people so obsessed with the royal family? I said, because they're celebrities. This is just celebrity gossip, isn't it?
Well, I have to say that this is a fascinating story because it's real than fiction. It's real life development. It rises above the trivia and tittle tattle that normally is associated with royal stories, and it becomes quite a serious one, actually, about the way Britain is run. And this is effectively an accusation that Meghan Markle, who was a high-profile member of the royal family, bullied and humiliated British civil servants who happened to be working in the royal household. And it raises all kinds of old-fashioned class distinctions and makes you wonder whether anyone who is not elected and who has no notable qualification should be given an office and indeed staff paid for by the British taxpayer. And at the time, Meghan Markle was being projected as an ambassador-style figure who would represent Britain abroad with her husband. And again, if the claims are true and the evidence seems very strong, this is clearly not an issue about racism or feminism. It's about old-fashioned bullying based on status and titles. And I have to say, another particularly disturbing and well-sourced claim in the story is that Miss Markle bullied female staff and knew that they had signed a non-disclosure agreement, which still applied when they left the palace. Now, the claims are of very serious psychological bullying, with women being humiliated by both Miss Markle and her husband, and this is while the pair of them were campaigning for women's voices to be heard. Now, workplace bullying cases are very bad at all times, but when the bosses allegedly responsible are continually portraying themselves as saints in the media, then the shock value is far greater, especially as the scandal was apparently hushed up.
Okay, so one more story for you, and before we discuss it, let's hear from Yusaku Maezawa, who on Twitter has put out an appeal asking people whether they want to come with him to the moon, and he's going to go up in a SpaceX, the company owned by Elon Musk. Here's the very short clip.
同乗者を募集します。8名。世界中から今回募集します。2023年中を予定してます。多様な方々からの応募をお待ちしています。
And I think we'll make a real difference. Thank you.
Nabila, would you go?
It's, you know, this story certainly has a Charlie and the Chocolate Factory feel about it.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
For that golden ticket to live out their dreams. And, you know, this Japanese billionaire is saying that he wants people from all kinds of backgrounds and that all those on board will fly for free. So, I would quite happily put my application through.
I don't think you're completely convinced. I would go immediately. Nigel?
Absolutely. The moment that TRT sent me this story, I registered. So I'm on his list along with millions of other people who would love to go up and go and see the moon. All you have to be, the only qualification is that you have to be an artist. And he says, as long as you say you're an artist, you're an artist. Well, I can do that. So I hope I get chosen.
OK, listen, we've only got like a minute and a half left. The more serious issue, 30 seconds, Nabila, or so. Should we be spending money on projects like this? I mean, this is a private project, but NASA, et cetera, while stuff is happening here on Earth that needs more immediate solutions? Well,
you know, I don't buy into this, you know, delaying strategy. Effectively, you know, we should focus on one thing and one thing only. I think, you know, it's fair to recognize that a lot of exciting things are happening in the world, and why not deal with an exciting project like that at a time like this? You know, it certainly has an adventurous feel to it, which a lot of people would love to know more about, and certainly more about what's going on the moon.
Sure, and Jeff Bezos would like to take you there as well. Nigel, 30 seconds. Do you think that the moon is a future home for humanity, considering how we're treating our own planet?
Yes, could well be. And what I do think is, despite COVID and everything else, what we really have to do is invest in the future. And so I'm right behind taxpayers' money going on space travel. And if private money can be put up, even better.
Love speaking to both of you, always. Nabila Ramdani and Nigel Nelson, thank you so much indeed. That's Behind the Headlines.